Welcome back to part 2 of our project in which we're building an iOS day counter on our iPhones in Objective-C. If you haven't watched part 1, please go and check it out. In it we have laid out the app graphically. Let's have a little look at it here. This is what it looked like. Just a massive label at the top, edit button here that brings up a date picker, and then we can cancel or save, and right now this doesn't do anything. So in this part of the course we're going to make sure we're going to hook up the buttons properly, add the code to subtract one date from another, and then make it display on the front page there. Now a little full disclosure thing here. I think this is about take 7 or 8 of me trying to record this video. This is absolutely weird that something always seems to go wrong. So the whole making of process was that I built this for myself, this app. I thought, hey, this makes a funky little project for my channel, so I'm gonna rehearse it once and make sure I explain things properly so that there's no questions, or that it's kind of logically presented. And that all worked flawlessly, and I thought, hey, that's perfect, I'm just going to start recording this. And then out of a sudden things went horribly wrong. So part 1 I had to start about 4 or 5 times because things with auto layout and constraints constantly went wrong. Terrible. Now this part, this is got to be my 6th or 7th take of this, because it just either never gets past the 3-minute mark, which we're reaching right now. Oh my god, it's terrible. Or something horribly goes wrong with either computers crashing or things, my brain freezes up and I can't remember things properly, and one of those things. Anyway, I hope this is going to work this time. In fact, I'm just going to keep recording no matter what happens, and if things don't work out, we'll just have to fix them on camera. There we go. Anyway, in this part we're going to worry about building code, and the first part of coding is going to happen in our AppDelegate implementation file. There are of course several other areas in which I could start coding, but I think AppDelegate will be accessible from both the settings view controller and the main view controller, and I'm going to put 2 methods in here. One is going to be for loading data and one is going to be for saving data, and I'm going to put them into AppDelegate because both classes have easy access to my AppDelegate class. Okay, so in AppDelegate, the implementation file in appdelegate.m, I'm going to put a pragma mark here, pragma mark, load and save. And in here at the bottom, I'm going to add 2 methods. The first one is going to be a load method, so it'll have to return an NSDate. NSDate, there it is. And I'm just going to call it load data. And that's really it here. And oh yeah, I need to return something. I'm going to return nil so that Xcode doesn't freak out and constantly shows me an error message here. The next method is going to be for saving, and it is a void method, so it doesn't return anything. It's just going to be called save data, and it'll take one parameter, which is an NSDate, and I'll just call it date. And that is it. Let's write the load data method first. This is not going to be anything fancy. It's just going to preserve the data in the NS user default. So we'll set one up. NS user defaults. I'm going to call them defaults. And it's a singleton method, which is NS user defaults standard user defaults. And now we can, well, actually we can't just load the data. We need to ask, is anything stored under the string value that has been saved? And speaking of saved, that is obviously slightly misspelled here. Save data. So it'll be an if then statement here first, and we're going to ask if there is no data. So if not, defaults value for key, and I'm just going to call it a start date. So that is the string under which I'm going to save my data in a minute in the save data thing. We're going to load this and say if it doesn't exist, then make sure the date that we're going to return, which I guess we're going to set up here, NSDate. I'll just call it also start date. and I'm not going to do anything to it. I'm just going to define it here. Then if there is no value saved in the user defaults, then I'm just going to make start date today, and that is done by calling an NSDate method with the parameter date, and that'll just return today as in right now, this second. If there is data there, then start date can be in fact defaults value for key start date, and then here we're going to return start date. So just to go through this again, I'm going to declare a variable start date. I'm not going to initialize it, it's just so that it exists. Then I'm going to declare a pointer to user defaults, standard user defaults. Then I'm going to ask if nothing is saved under the key start date, then create a date object with just the time and date of right now. If there is something there, then retrieve it from memory and then return it, and so we can use it in our app. That's how that works. If we don't do that, then there may be a nil object that's being returned, and that'll be like terrible for the rest of the app, and of course would mean the end of the universe as we know it. So in save data, we do much the same, but we assume that there's definitely a value coming in here as date. So once again, we're going to set up NS user defaults, and that'll be NS user defaults standard user defaults. You can also create this in as a one-liner, but it's extremely terrible. It's extremely difficult to read, so I like to split this up into 2 lines of code, just in case you've ever seen this as a really long notation. You can of course do that, and the computer will understand that. It's just easier for me to type it in, and you know, it makes more sense if you read through the code. So user defaults, in this case we're going to have to go defaults, and we'll call set value for key. So the value is of course our date, so let's type date, and it can be any NS object that we can store in, well, most NS objects can be stored in the user defaults that way. For the key, that'll be start date. And the last thing I need to do is I need to call the synchronize methods so that data actually persists. You may have noticed that synchronize does actually return a bool here. If we do this again, this does return a bool. So if you want to check did this method work or not, then you can read that out and return that, but we're going to assume everything's going to be fine, and that's it. That's it for loading and saving. The only other thing I need to do is I need to copy these method signatures and put them into the header file here between the add interface and end. And I need that because these are public methods, and my other 2 classes need to be able to read them, and they do that by just reading the header files here. Okay, so that is that, and let us implement this method in, say, the settings view controller. Let's head over there to the implementation file, settings view implementation file, and so that we can actually communicate with the AppDelegate, let us import it up here. # import AppDelegate. In fact, I'm also going to set up a property here, and I'm going to declare, I'm going to make my own AppDelegate, and we'll see why in a minute. I'm just going to call it my AppDelegate, and I will do that. I will set up a custom initializer for this so that this is always set up in case somebody asks for it, and this is done by asking, does the variable to that pointer already exist, or if not, then instantiate it. So if not my AppDelegate, so that's the variable, then my AppDelegate, we're just going to initialize that. And in fact, let me show you what happens if I just initialize that with UI application, shared application dot delegate. That is technically the app delegate, and I'm just going to return my app delegate down here. That is probably not going to work. Is it going to work? No, it's not going to work. And this is because, well, it is going to work, but the warning here says, well, look, whatever comes out of UI application shared application dot delegate is not necessarily what I've declared up here, which is an instance of the app delegate class as in what it's defined here in code. So that's just Xcode saying, well, a standard UI application class comes out of here, not what we've declared here, which is the app delegate class, and in it we have custom methods, which is why we need to typecast this. So just to make this warning go away, we can add a cast to it. So app delegate there, that makes that go away, and that is exactly what we want. Okay, so now that we've done that, what we really want under view did load, we would like to load some data from the app delegate. We can either put that directly into view did load, or we can just write another little method for that, which is going to be a void method, and that's going to be populate UI. And in our case, that is just retrieving whatever value is stored in memory and putting that into the date picker, so that when somebody goes into the settings and there is a value stored, then the date picker will already display whatever is stored, rather than a default or today's date, which is what we don't want. So in order to do that, we're gonna say we can do this in one line: self date picker dot date is in fact self my app delegate load data. I hope this makes sense. It calls the method from my app delegate out here, which returns an NS date, and we're going to put that into the date property of our date picker, and that is that. So all we're going to do here in view did load is call that method under self populate UI, and then that should set up our date picker. Now when the cancel button is pressed, we've already done everything that we need to do, which is dismiss the view controller. As soon as the save button is pressed, however, we need to save the data and then dismiss the view controller. So let's do that here. Save data, and it is almost a similar one-liner. We're just gonna maybe make it into two lines. So we're gonna go ns date start. Whoops, needs to have a little asterisk here. Start date, and we're gonna take that from our date picker. So self date picker dot date, and now we're gonna give that start date to the method in app delegate. So self my app delegate save data start date. There we go, and that is that. You can of course put self date picker date right into here, and then that'll shorten the code a little bit. It's just one of those things, you know, it makes it a little bit more readable in my book. And that is everything that we need to do in here. Now, the only other thing that, and that's why I said earlier, this recording has gone horribly wrong so many times. I just want to check something. These dots here, they should really be grayed out, and I bet when we left part 1 they were, and for some bizarre reason they are no longer. So let me just go back into that storyboard and check out if they're properly hooked up here, because I have a horrible feeling they may not be hooked up. Interesting, they appear to be hooked up. Always good to check these things. So my save data button in the will actually call that. That's perfect, and that is in fact the date picker. Yeah, okay, cool. So maybe it's just a little Xcode 9 bug. Oh, there we go. They are now grayed out. So usually this means white knob means things are not connected, and grayed, like a filled with gray type thing, means this is connected to code. Don't know why this didn't show up. Just got my warning flags up there. So anyway, that is what we need to do in the settings view controller. Let us head over to the standard view controller and implement some funky date methods, which is really why we've come here, I guess. So right now it has nothing, but in it down here, I'm also going to create one method, which is a void method. Much like on the settings view controller, I'm going to say populate UI again. And all that'll do is much the same thing that we did with the date picker. We're going to populate the label that we have here. Now to do that, we need to write another method in a moment. So I'm just going to make sure we're going to add populate UI into the view to load method here. Populate UI, there we go. And let's see, the other method that we need is one that will subtract one date from another and return a string. So let's set that up. It's a method that returns and then a string, and I'll call it calculate days. And I'm gonna take one NS date coming in here, and I'm going to call it start date. And that'll assume that I will calculate whatever start date from today, or today I'm going to work out the difference between today and the start date that I'm going to give that method. And then of course I'm going to return first of all nil, so that Xcode is happy, which is of course what we all live for, to make Xcode happy. And the people at Apple, because they're so nice, aren't they? Yes. Anyway, we need to start here with an NS calendar object, if I remember that correctly. So let's create one, NS calendar, and I'm going to call it calendar. And this is going to be NS calendar alloc init with calendar identifier. Now they do this because an NS date really only saves a number, and it's a number, it's in fact the number of seconds that have elapsed since the 1st of January 2000 or 2001. I think it was 2001. And anything before that is kind of regarded as the past, and it's one of those things that makes it possible to literally just count seconds, and then anything can be inferred from that. So in our case, we live in the Western world, or I live in the Western world, so hence the Gregorian calendar is what makes most sense to me. So that's the guy, that is basically the counting system that tells us February has 28 days unless it's a leap year, in which case it has 29, and January and March have 31 days, but April has 30 days. That's what the Gregorian calendar does. So we do init with calendar identifier, NS calendar identifier. There we go. This is a huge list of other types of calendars we could be using for that. Coptic, Hebrew, Indian, Chinese, Buddhist, because Steve Jobs was Buddhist, so they had to put Buddhist in there. But we're really interested in the Gregorian calendar. So let's use that. And now that we have a calendar object, it now knows when that perhaps the 24th of February 1975 was a Wednesday or something, because it can be inferred. It just needs to calculate that, and that's how that works. So now that we've done that, there's another part of the puzzle with all calendar calculations, and those are NS date components. And they're basically components like year, day, month, second, hour, minute, and so forth. And we need to use those in order to figure out how many days have elapsed, because days is really what we're interested in. So let's set some up. NS date components, I'll call it components. And I'm going to invoke a method on our calendar object. And it's called components from date to date. So this will return me components in a unit, which is the next question here, an NS calendar unit. So that's NS calendar unit day. That's what I'm after. From date to date. So from date is of course the start date. But the to date we haven't actually worked out yet, and I will just call that today for now, and I will of course get a massive error message because today doesn't exist yet. So I will hope I can keep this happy. Options we don't need, so options we put to nil, and here we're gonna define today. I'm going to put a comment here because we need to do something else to today. We can't just, we do that in part 3 because this part's running long already. So nsDate date today equals nsDate date. No Xcode date, there we go. Okay, now today is present and that's perfect. Define calendar and components. So the only other thing that we need to work out now is how do we get the days from our components. So that is an NSU integer, and I'll just call it days, just a standard integer number, and I'm going to ask the components for the number of days that have elapsed between these times. So in fact, I'm just going to ask for components day, and then I can just return the days here. And that should be that. Why does that not work? All right, yes, because of very funny, yes. So I'm just returning the NSU integer here. That's why Xcode is freaking out, and I promised I was going to return a string, which I haven't done, so it's terrible. I shall do that now. NS string with format, and I can never really remember what that is. I think it's %i, and then I'm going to say days. Is that correct? Xcode is usually very nice and says we can auto fix this. Replace %i with %lu. Yes, of course, let's do that. It's one of those things my brain will never ever pick up what %@ clonk schlonz sign I need to put in there just to print that out in a string. So let's see where we are now. If we're going to run this, then at least we should be able to set a date, and upon a consequent relaunch, so nothing's updated yet, but if I bring that up again, then what should happen is the label should update, which it does not. Interesting. Yes, because I haven't populated the UI method yet, but it certainly has remembered say the 22nd of January 2017. So as soon as I launch my app again, then that date is certainly remembered in the settings view. Now the reason why this label hasn't updated on relaunch is because I haven't put anything into the populate UI method yet. So obviously I need to do that. As soon as we launch, we need to call that method, and in fact go self days label text needs to be updated with whatever is being returned from my calculate days labels here. So and in fact, in order for that to happen, we also need to be able to load the value from our user defaults, aren't we? So yes, let's import the AppDelegate into here as well. Let's leave that method here for now. In fact, let's just get rid of this for now, and set up another property, just like we did on the settings view controller. Property, and it'll be an AppDelegate, and we'll call it my AppDelegate again. There. And just like before, we're going to set up a custom initializer here. No Xcode, not at all, not at all. There we go. And we'll say if my AppDelegate does not exist, then my AppDelegate will be initialized with the typecast of AppDelegate and it'll be UI application shared application dot delegate, of course, and then we're going to return that variable. How exciting. Now in populate UI, as I was saying earlier, we're going to go self days label text, and that will be the output of self my AppDelegate load data. No, it won't. It will be the output of my self calculate days method, and in calculate days I can in fact do self my AppDelegate load data. There, that's what I meant with code is not particularly readable. So let me just write that out again and grab an NSDate method from my self AppDelegate load data, and once I have that, I can just go and pop that into here. Start date. Right, that makes more sense. So this is using several methods at once. So first we've declared our AppDelegate custom initializer here, so we have access to this class using the property of self my AppDelegate. That makes sense, hopefully. Then we're going to populate UI, and in it we're going to grab the date that has been saved in user defaults, and we're going to put that into the days label.text property using this method here, calculate days, which we're giving the start date, and calculate days has been defined down here. It will calculate the amount of elapsed days from a start date that we're going to give it compared to today. I'm just going to make one single quick note here. That's something we need to fix in the next video, and that is called normalize today. And that's a method we haven't written yet, but we will in the next video, where we're going to talk more about NSDate components and so forth. We're basically doing all this again in a more abstracted way so that we can set the time of this object to nil. So just to check if this is working, let's launch all this again, and that should now come up with a very different number here. That is very exciting. So 429 days that have elapsed since February. So if I put that back to 2018, then that should be obviously 365 days less than that. If I hit save, then that date will be saved, but this label won't be updated. So we're going to deal with that in the next video as well. But if I launch the app again, then that number should have updated, and it's now 64 days. Okay, this is success, and also another part of success, even though it was a rocky road. Thank you for sticking with me here, but I have recorded part 2 of this video finally. This is good, this is good. I'm going to go celebrate now, probably by recording part 3, so we can almost finish this project. I do apologize if things haven't gone as smoothly as usual, but it's one of those things. It's been I don't know, it's just, I don't think this project wanted to be recorded for some reason. I don't really know why. We're going to talk more about the days and the NS calendar and about the date components in the next video, where we're going to update this label automatically and normalize the date. Stick around for that. If you like this video, of course, share it with friends, family, and total strangers, and don't forget to subscribe to my channel. I'll see you in part 3. Bye bye.